Spiritual essence is, in its simple being, pure consciousness, and this self-consciousness. The originally determinate nature of the individual has lost its positive meaning of being in itself the element and the purpose of its activity. It is merely a superseded moment, and the individual is a self in the form of a universal self. Conversely, the formal matter in hand gets its filling from the active self-differentiating individuality, for the differences within the latter constitute the content of that universal. The category is, in itself or implicit, as the universal of pure consciousness. It is equally for itself or explicit for the self of consciousness, is equally a moment of it. It is absolute being, for that universality is the simple self-identity of being. With paragraph 419, we're entering into a new subsection, or rather sub-subsection, of reason. This is the second to last. It's actually pretty short, just 10 paragraphs long, and some of those paragraphs are quite short, although 2 of them are actually quite long as well. This one is called Reason as Lawgiver, or Die gesetzgebende Vernunft. Pretty straightforward translation there. And what is reason giving laws to? That's something that we want to think about right at the start. So we've already dealt with laws quite a bit earlier on in the reason section. You remember the very first part of observing reason. Right? We saw all sorts of interesting things. Reason turns to the external world and tries to make sense of it. It runs into some problems when it encounters the organic, living thing. Then it tries to come up with laws for that. When it gets to human beings, it tries to come up with psychological and logical laws. Those are also difficult as well. But we see reason continually, or rather rational self-consciousness, continually attempting to do this. And we also saw a very important discussion of laws in the force and the understanding part, way back in the first major part of the work, the consciousness section. That was actually the culmination of it. The understanding was attempting to give laws and at the same time to figure out where it resided in relation to these laws. And how these laws were connected with each other. Also in terms of force, worlds, things like that. Here, what we see is the rational self-consciousness carrying forward the project that we've just gone through in the entire last section, which was dealing with the Sache selbst, or it was translated as the heart of the matter, the matter in hand, and we could think about this as sort of the meaningful project by which the self-consciousness was attempting to make sense of itself in relation to the rest of the world, make sense of itself as a self-consciousness. So what we have now is self-consciousness attempting to take that further. And remember, we had some sort of resolution at the end of this section, the last section, and give itself laws. Now, why give itself laws? Does it just, there aren't enough laws out there and it needs to find a few more? No, this is in a really architectonic sense. This is, giving itself rules or norms that are supposed to make sense, not only tell it what to do, but make sense of where it fits in and what sort of thing it really is. Now, Hegel begins by talking about spiritual essence, a term that was brought up in the end of the last section, geistige Wesen. And at the beginning of this, everything is a nice unity. We're going to see that break down, as it always seems to happen as we go through the phenomenology, as we dialectically proceed. But he begins by saying that spiritual essence is, in its simple being, pure consciousness, reine Bewusstsein, right? This is going to be the universal, as we're going to see here. And it's a universal self. It's not just a bare, abstract universal, but it is pure consciousness. And notice that he doesn't say that it's pure self-consciousness at that point. Then on the other side, he says it's also this self-consciousness. And the self is being stressed there, right? This individual self-consciousness, the guy that I happen to be, or whoever it is that you happen to be watching this, right? An individuality. So he goes on and he says, we've made a few progresses. So the originally determinate nature of the individual, we saw that as something that was being worked out in the past section, right? It was talked about very early on. You have this original nature, like maybe you have musical talent, or you have a penchant for helping people out because you have a highly developed, sort of naturally there sense of compassion, or you have some other thing that's motivating you and it's supposed to flow out of who you are. Hegel says that this has lost its positive meaning of being in itself the element and purpose of its activity. So we're no longer really concerned about that. It's still there. It's been sublated, right? It's been aufgehoben, and it's there, but now it's part of a system. Now it's part of something more. So he goes on and he says, it's lost its positive meaning of being in itself the element and purpose of its activity. It's merely a superseded, aufgehobene, moment. And the individual is a self in the form of a universal self, which is on this side over here. Then he says, conversely, here he starts bringing up form and content, which is going to be playing some role, actually a pretty important role throughout this section. Not always in exactly the same way, but it's going to be playing some role. So we have form on this side, the side of pure consciousness. We have content on this side, the side of this self-consciousness or individuality. So he says, the formal matter in hand gets its filling, it needs filling, right, from the active self-differentiating individuality. The person acting within the world, which is also a world of culture and a world of other self-consciousnesses. So he says the differences within the latter constitute the content of that universal. Now what we want to think about here is, so each individual is conceiving of itself in relation to this sort of universal self or pure consciousness, and it projects its own sort of vision of that. Then there, on this side, this is split up into a number of different individual consciousnesses, each of which is going to have its own viewpoint on what the universal consciousness is. So he says, the category, remember we talked about this in the previous paragraphs, is in itself or implicit. And the category here is the spiritual essence. This is in itself. This is implicit. That means that it now has to be unfolded. What is the for itself? Notice what he says here. It's not the individual, but rather pure consciousness, which is here, in this case, the for itself. He says it's for itself or explicit, right? The universal, it's the universal of pure consciousness, right? The self of consciousness is equally a moment of it. So the self, the individual self, is being sort of brought under the heading of something that strikes us a bit more as abstract, but we want to keep it from turning into a mere abstraction. So he says, it is absolute being, for that universality is the simple self-identity of being. And there he's talking about this entire scope, right? This is absolute being, but do we know yet what absolute being really is? No, now we have to explore it and unfold it, and we're going to find out that it won't be quite what it promised itself to be at the beginning, because it never is. Thus, what is object for consciousness has the significance of being the true. It is, and it is authoritative in the sense that it exists and is authoritative in and for itself. It is the absolute matter in hand, which no longer suffers from the antithesis of certainty and its truth, between universal and individual, between purpose and its reality, but whose existence is the reality and action of self-consciousness. This matter in hand is therefore the ethical substance, and consciousness of it is the ethical consciousness. Its object is likewise for it the true, for it combines self-consciousness and being in a single unity. It has the value of the absolute, for self-consciousness cannot and does not want any more to go beyond this object, for in it is in communion with itself. It cannot, for it is all being and all power. It does not want to, for it is the self or the will of this self. The object is in its own self real as object, for it contains within itself the distinction characteristic of consciousness. It divides itself into masses, or spheres, which are the determinate laws of the absolute essence. These masses, however, do not obscure the notion, for the moments of being and pure consciousness and of the self remain enclosed within it, a unity which constitutes the essence of these masses, and which, in this distinction, no longer lets these moments fall apart from one another. Things have gotten off to a really promising start at the beginning of this section, and in paragraph 420, Hegel is going to continue this line of development in a way that suggests that now we're finally getting to the core of what it is to realize one's life project, to understand where one fits in. Now, this is by identifying oneself at this point with the absolute. And it's not going to turn out to be quite so straightforward or simple as that, of course. But we have to first sort of climb the hill, and then we can start taking the roller coaster all the way down into the dialectical depths. So let's start where he starts. There's a lot going on in this paragraph, a lot of very abstract terminology that we're going to want to think our way through. So he says, thus, what is object for consciousness? What consciousness is grasping in this has the significance of being the true. And we're going to see true come up several times in here. This is something that we've been seeking out the entire time. There is a sort of continual ebb and flow of beginning with certainty, and then, working out what's contained within that certainty and asking the question, but is this certainty true? And then eventually moving on to the true, which for Hegel is never going to be something so straightforward as just, correspondence between objects and our talking about them or thinking about them. That's a little bit of truth, but truth encompasses so much more. It's part of a system, and it also has to take account of the truth understander or truth bringer, that is the subjective object, the self-consciousness, which then, of course, brings in other people. So this gets very complicated very quick, but I just wanted to sort of throw that out there in this first sentence. So what does he say after this? The translation is a little bit misleading at this point, Miller's translation, because he says, it is, and it is authoritative, which means that it sounds like it's speaking with authority or something along those lines. There's nothing like that going on here. The German is es ist, and the verb is gelten, es gelt, right? It holds. It is valid. It attests, you might say, to what is being said. We use that term for when something, we could say it's authentic. Authoritative, authentic, either one of those works. I would really just prefer to say it is valid, or it holds, or it provides what it says that it does. He says, in the sense that it exists and is authoritative in and for itself. And what are we talking about there? What's the it? The it is what we just looked at in the previous paragraph, and also the paragraph before that ended the last section, the absolute matter in hand, which now is no longer something extrinsic to the individual, but is something that is integrated. Or you might say the individual is integrated within it. So the absolute matter in hand, the absolute Sache. He's not saying Sache selbst at this point, in part because I don't think he actually needs to. So he says, it is the absolute matter in hand, which no longer, here's a key point, no longer suffers from an antithesis or opposition between these different things. And what is the antithesis ultimately between? The universal and the individual. But Hegel will frame it in terms of certainty on one side, which I think you can here associate with the universal, or you might be able to switch it over to this side, and then truth on the side of the individual. It all depends on which sort of perspective you're adopting on it. But there is this tension there that now has been brought within the scope of the absolute. So they're no longer merely opposed to each other. There's no longer an antithesis in the sense of a stopping point. Look, pick one or pick the other, right? It's now that they exist in opposition or tension, but within the scope of the absolute matter in hand. The other way that he talks about it is in terms of purpose and reality. This should make us think back to all of this discussion about the nature of human action and the fact that the purpose or intention, the Zweck, or sometimes translated as the end, right, rarely turns out to conform exactly to the reality when we attempt to take it from the merely ideal and realize it. Great example are these videos. Nothing ever turns out quite like I expect them to, I used that as an earlier example in one of the videos. Now, he says, it no longer suffers from this antithesis of certainty and its truth between universal and individual, between purpose and reality. Instead, this is the absolute matter at hand, has its existence is the reality and action of self-consciousness. So it's self-consciousness here that is, in fact, connecting the universal and the individual. And this makes sense. One of the important aspects of self-consciousness is precisely the fact that through our reflexivity, our relation to ourselves, we're able not just to see ourselves in terms of some sort of pure individuality, but in terms of universals and in relation to other people, which means in relation to other self-consciousnesses. I'll give you an example. The mere act of wearing a tie, right? So I picked out this tie today in part because I like the way that it looks, the gold against the blue. Probably has to do with the fact that not only is it a nice color combination, but I went to several different schools where blue and gold were in fact the colors. First, my elementary school where it was really about this sort of color, and then my high school where it was a more yellowish gold, but it's still blue and gold nonetheless, right? So you say, well, that's so subjective, Dr. Sadler. Yes, but the notion of wanting to wear something that matches takes me already from the realm of purely individual sentiments and perceptions and sensibilities into something that, while it may not be totally universal, I am certainly treating it as universal. And notice that all the stuff that we said before about content and form fits into that. This is the content, this color, this color. But the form is something like picking things that match. And you can abstract that away from any determinate sets of colors, although you can't really drive the point home without introducing some colors. So that provides, I think, a useful example. Let me give you another example that, again, has to do with the tie. I picked out this tie in part because it's a matter of course. I wear a tie and usually a jacket, sometimes a sweater or something like that, when I create these videos. So it's sort of my uniform. but I get to pick what tie and what shirt and what jacket I'm going to wear out of the lot that I've got in my closet. Now, that's all on the side of the individual. Yet, what's the deal with my wearing a tie? I am, by virtue of establishing this kind of consistency, which is, a decision on my part, doing something that's more universal. I'm, in some respects, introducing the universal in the process of universalizing by wearing a tie. So these are some really, really trivial examples, but I wanted to use that because it drives home how deeply rooted what Hegel is talking about really is, this tension, this ongoing tension between universal and individual in terms of the matter at hand. All right, back to the text now after our excursion into haberdashery, right? First time I've ever used that word in a video. All right, so he goes on and he says, it's the absolute matter in hand. It no longer suffers from this antithesis, right? And this matter in hand is therefore what? The ethical substance. Something that we thought we lost so many sections ago and have been seeking ever since. We've got the ethical substance. We have our hands on it. We're at least pulling at the hem of the robe, right? And so he goes on and he says, not only do we have here the ethical substance, the matter in hand as the ethical substance, but the consciousness of it is the ethical consciousness. So we are grasping the good here in the matter in hand, in a way very different than how we began in talking about our own project and the matter in hand. We also have it as the true. He says, for it combines self-consciousness and being in a single unity. Now notice that the true has been talked about in several different complementary ways here. Here he's saying it's combining self-consciousness and being in a single unity. There what we're talking about is something more similar to the notion of truth as adequation, right? Or correspondence, adequation between the being, the sein, and self-consciousness. But now it's not just consciousness of being, it's self-consciousness of being in a unity, right? Again, what's the unity? This absolute matter in hand. The other way that he talked about it was that it is and is authoritative, right? That, it has being, or it exists, and it is valid, right? Now, if we go on, he says, this has the value of the absolute. Self-consciousness cannot and does not want any more to go beyond this object. Self-consciousness, rational self-consciousness, has arrived at something that it looks like it could be content with. And he goes on and he says, why can it not go beyond this? It is all being and all power. All being and all power. Everything is contained within it. It does not want to, for it is the self, or the will of this self. So at this point, if the phenomenology were to stop right here, it looks like we have something that we have been seeking this entire time, doesn't it? Hegel never stops like that, though. Now we go on and introduce something else that looks at first as if it's going to make everything even better, even more comprehensible. But what we're doing here is sowing the seeds of the dissolution of the absolute matter in hand, the absolute Sache, by introducing a new kind of individuation that is also one of universality. You might say, to put it in other terms, we are now going to talk about universality in terms of universalities in the plural. This should remind you of the force and the understanding section. So he says, the object is, it's in its own self, real as object. For it contains within itself the distinction characteristic of consciousness. What is the distinction characteristic of consciousness? He tells us it divides itself. Consciousness is a unity and yet is also a plurality bound together in that unity. And as soon as you introduce plurality, we can now once again have antitheses coming up, as we're going to see. So he says it divides itself into masses, Massen, or spheres. And so, it's just the same word, Massen, right? We could call them masses, we could call them spheres. I actually would prefer the word domains if we're thinking about, the ethical substance and the sorts of things that it applies to, because if you look ahead to the paragraphs yet to come, the examples that Hegel uses are things like truth-telling, or benevolence. These would be sort of determinate domains of the ethical substance. And Hegel is going to call these determinate laws of absolute essence. Bestimmte Gesetze, absolute Wesen, right? Absolute Wesen. So, what do we have here? Well, these are the ways in which the matter in hand, now understood as the true and understood as the good, as ethical substance, is made more concrete. It's put into application, you might say. So he goes on and he says, these masses don't obscure the notion, not yet at least, right? For the moments of being and pure consciousness and of the self remain enclosed within it. This is a unity which constitutes the essence of these masses, right? The absolute essence, and which in this distinction no longer lets these moments fall apart from one another. Well, this sounds pretty awesome. This sounds like we've finally attained what it was that we didn't realize we'd been seeking until about halfway through the reason section, which is to find the ethical substance, which is also the true. Now, at this point in the phenomenology, everything is being held together, but it's an unstable tension, as we're going to see in the paragraphs yet to come.